Thanks, Charlie. I'm going to ask our first panel actually to come up. And again, these are just perspectives to get us started on that. Others in the audience might have slightly different perspectives. Mark talked about a subset. I think if I'm listening to Charlie's trends, I think we need to get out of the subset and make sure that the whole system thinks about sustainability. And as I understand the Sustainability Development Goals, they are about development as well as investment in emerging blue economy sectors. So again, we're going to move on to our first panel here to have a discussion a little bit, and I'll turn it over to our moderator, Admiral Gaffney. To do that, you could either work from down there, if that's comfortable for you all, or work from up here. Okay? Great.
Yeah, we're 10 minutes behind time, so we'll sit here. Good afternoon. I'm Paul Gaffney. Seated with me is Dr. Jerry Schubel, who is a Monmouth University ocean champion. Congratulations. He and his wife, Margaret, are going to be honored at Stony Brook tonight. He's a longtime provost there, former head of the New England Aquarium, and currently the CEO of the Aquarium of the Pacific. Thank you, Jerry. Next to him, Rear Admiral Linda Fagan, obviously a career Coast Guard officer. I have a Coast Guard joke that doesn't really work for you about the height of a Coast Guard officer, but she is a graduate of the National Defense University. We both spent some time there, and she has been the head of the Coast Guard District with headquarters in Boston, and is now the Principal Deputy for Operations for the entire United States Coast Guard, a busy place, going to get busier. And on the very end, Dr. Paul Doremus, who is the Acting Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and has been the Deputy Administrator of NOAA, and maybe started or stopped within the last 24 hours. But he is a career officer, has worked in the Office of Technology Assessment for the Congress, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and he is really the chief strategist for NOAA. Thank you, all of you, for being here. So, look, I like to call this the power. We're on the Power Coast. Someplace in the room is Laura Cantrell, and she does these events on various coasts, and every coast has a name. The Treasure Coast, the First Coast, the Emerald Coast. I call it the Power Coast. There is so much intellectual capital here. There is so much money here. There is so much international policy that's made here. This is the densest, most densely populated area of America, and it's all jammed up against the coast. There's more communication here of every sort, surface, air, sea, and digital here than any place. And incredible communication. So this is where the power of the United States is of any place. So I call it the Power Coast. So very important that you convene this meeting, Tony. Just a moment about balance. If you go on the internet and you think about, gee, what am I going to say about the next 12.25 years, 2030, or any future prognostication about the future of the ocean economy or the ocean environment, it's pretty negative. People start telling you what all the burdens are. What are we going to do to change our behavior? On and on and on. I don't get a rosy picture. In fact, it could be rosy. In fact, we should, I think, also dwell in a balanced way on the possibilities for the future and the successes that we've had. Seated in this audience someplace is Dr. Tavat Najarian, who I think took up Pete Seeger's charge in 1966 when he started singing about how dirty the Hudson River was. About 30 years later, I heard Dr. Najarian talk about what progress we had made in the Delaware River and the Hudson River. Right? So we do make progress. We need to watch about the threats, but we do make progress. And I hope that today, in the next 24 hours while we're here, we think about the balance, the good and the threats. And finally, as I just mentioned, 2030, our goal date here is 12.25 years from now, not very far in my opinion. If you think about all the vehicles, the autonomous vehicles and instruments that we have here today, ones that Scott Glenn has created and et cetera, most of the funding for that started during the Cold War. We're using them now. So things don't move that quickly. So I am optimistic, but I don't see violent or really strange change in the next 12.25 years. I don't know why you picked that date, Tony, but nonetheless.
It's a nice brain.
So, besides that introduction, Tony asked me if I would give my own, some of my own expectations for the 12.25 years from now. And so, as our native New Jerseyan Yogi Berra said, forecasting is very difficult, especially about the future. So, but let me give you a couple of ideas. Some are big and some are small. One, I think I will see incremental improvements in the living coastlines of our area. Right? Sometimes it's borough by borough, it's oysters here, it's a dune there, it's a marsh sill there, it's some longitudinal barrier there. People are making those decisions borough by borough, company by company, people that own the waterfront. Secondly, the world is growing to 9 billion people. It's going to continue to need some protein from the sea. And hunting and gathering of fish, you'll probably, with reasonable regulation, will probably level out over that period of time, but we'll still need more protein. So mariculture is coming. This is a lead for Jerry. And if we can get that mariculture to grow and eat plants instead of other fish, we won't get into a death spiral. And I think that this new tool of eDNA will help us identify habitats. Already some investments being made in this mid-Atlantic area, and I think that will have a steady growth in this time period. Okay, one of the favorite people I've heard from in my life is Charlie Colgan. He wrote the best part of the 654-page Ocean Commission report, Annex C, where he talked about thousands of people moving to a coastal watershed county every day. He persists in predicting that, and I agree. I think people are going to continue to crowd us right up to the water's edge, and that will, for us, I think, necessitate that these people and the people they work for will demand knowledge about the ocean, and therefore, slowly but surely, people will communicate better about what's going on in the ocean. Also, I think his slides indicate that as more people jam in here, they like to go to the beach on the weekend, and they'll continue to do that, maybe even not in the summer. I'm big on maritime trade increasing. Look, the Panama Canal has changed our life in the maritime business. It got bigger, the ships are getting bigger, they're getting deeper. Right? The ports are getting deeper, the Bayonne Bridge is getting higher. Right? And there will be more ports around the world that require service. Already now, somewhere between 80 and 90% of the world's commerce goes by ship. I think, Howard, that some of these ships are actually going to be quieter. Right? Their propellers are not going to cavitate. They're going to insulate the ship. They'll have flow. They'll improve the shape of the ship so the flow noise is less. It will be better. And we think a lot about our behavior in this particular issue. Right? What do? Do we slow down? Do we change course because of something in the water? Well, we have to think about, in the long term, in our research, about coexistence. Not just changing our behavior, but seducing wildlife to also cooperate with us. I think science is going to be on a steady rise. We're going to see new and more sensors. Already, Scott Glenn's here someplace. We have more high-frequency radar sensing the surface of the ocean in this particular area than any place else, probably in the world, but certainly in this country. eDNA leadership right here in this region at the NOAA labs and at Rockefeller, to name a few, and passive acoustic monitoring, so we can really make good decisions about our interaction with wildlife is important. There's work going on off Long Island now, just south off the coast of the Carolinas, and this is a way that we can look at the biodiversity of our environment and measure it over the long term. Likewise, there will be more things in the water column. Maybe there'll be more ships. Surely there'll be more ships, but there may be more things below the surface. A big problem for the Coast Guard, not a big problem, a big opportunity for the Coast Guard, because they have to manage that traffic and the information. There'll be more and more things, some things planted on the bottoms, some things sticking up into the air with big windmills on the top, but all kinds of sensors, passive and active sensors, and we will need to manage that, and I predict that will happen. Finally, I don't make a prediction about renewable energy offshore. 10 years ago, New Jersey was probably number 1 or number 2 as great possibilities. 10 years ago, we're talking about what's going on next. In 12.25 years, I'm not so worried about the windmills offshore. I am very, very high on there being an electricity backbone buried in the sediment offshore the coast of New Jersey. The New Jersey Energy Link, I think, would be a great thing. And as far as oil and gas go, look, I'm all for regulating once we know something is there, not regulating before we don't know what's there. So I'd like to see some level of exploration, but let's rely on the southeast United States to do that over the next 12.25 years. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jerry Schubel.
Can I use that? I have
Yes,
some
sir.
slides. I thought the power was in California, actually, Paul.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so the time frame is 2030, and Tony, again, as the Admiral has said, is not very far away, less than 13 years. That's not very long to see the major advances. But I think it could be long. It's Schubel JRS final. You can find it on there. It was there. Yeah. Yes, that's it. I think it could be long enough for the United States to redefine its relationship to the ocean and to reassert its intention to reclaim a leadership role as a maritime nation. I think we've lost sight of both of those. We don't have a clearly articulated national policy on our relationship to the ocean, and we certainly are no longer a leading maritime nation. We may be a leader in research and in technology development, and probably even in fisheries management, but we're a laggard in many of the ocean areas that will figure prominently in 2030 and beyond. Marine aquaculture and large-scale ocean projects are two of those where we clearly are a laggard, and I'm going to focus on those. But just to reinforce something the Admiral has said, we sit between two great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and we've got the Gulf of Mexico to the south, and we've got the Arctic Ocean to the north, so we indeed are an ocean nation. And we have the largest EEZ of any nation on Earth. We have an area larger under the water than all of the land areas exposed above. I think it's inevitable that we will look to the ocean in the future for more food, more minerals, more energy, more shipping and transportation, and yes, more recreation and tourism as people want to get out of the overcrowded, overly hot cities. We will also look to the ocean for more fresh water. We're doing that in California now. And Charlie, I do think we will look to it for more biopharmaceuticals in the future. Sea level is rising. It's been rising for a long time. And most of our settlement of the coast, though, took place during a period of stable sea level. And that's when the great coastal cities were created, and we built an awful lot of infrastructure. And now sea level is rising, and it will continue to rise for decades and probably longer, no matter how much we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. That's not an excuse for not reducing them. We must. But many of these effects are already baked in, and so we really have to learn how to adapt to a higher stand of sea level. Richard Syrett was quite a remarkable guy. When he was president of Carnegie Mellon, he took over when the university was troubled financially. It had only a modest reputation. And he made the statement that universities spend too much time figuring out how to survive and not enough time figuring out how to thrive. I think that's true not only of universities, but of many and perhaps all of our institutions. We're in the Anthropocene, the geological epoch where humans have a major impact on Earth processes and ecosystems, and certainly not just on climate change. And I think it's important to recognize that we will be in the Anthropocene for as long as there are humans on this planet. So let's figure out how we can thrive in this new epoch. When you ask what are the most important factors driving the future of the blue ocean economy, I think it's more about what are the factors that are impeding the future of the blue ocean economy in the United States. Yes, we certainly have to protect ocean ecosystems because the ocean, after all, is the largest single component in Earth's life support system. Let's look quickly at just food. It's interesting that here we have the ocean covering about 71% of the Earth's surface. It provides only 2% of the world's food on a caloric basis. Yes, it provides 16% of the protein, but only 2% of the total food. By 2050, the UN says we will need 70% more food to feed an additional 2.5 billion people. That won't come from traditional agriculture, and it won't come from wild capture fisheries. Traditional agriculture already consumes about 70% of the available fresh water and more than half of Earth's ice-free land surface. We will have another green revolution. 2 days ago, I spent the day in a Wall Street Journal forum on the future of food. A lot of exciting things are happening in agriculture. But the ocean is going to have to play a bigger role. Most climate scientists predict that the production of food on land will decrease by 10 to 15%. There was a recent UN study that showed that the U.S. should be a leader in offshore marine aquaculture because we have the largest EEZ of any nation. And there was another study that said that we could produce an amount of seafood in our EEZ in an area the size of Lake Michigan. I don't know if this has a pointer. I'm not going to, but what? The green. Okay, there's Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan, the total area is less than 1/10% of the EEZ. It's actually about 0.07%. Can you imagine putting that somewhere in that light blue area and producing as much seafood as the total world wild harvest? And yet today we don't have one, not a single finfish farm that is permitted anywhere in U.S. federal waters. One has been proposed for off the south shore of Long Island. We've got one that's been proposed for about 2 years now off the California coast near San Diego, and they're no closer to getting a permit than they were 2 years ago, and they've spent a couple of $1 million. Now, is that because we don't have an interest by entrepreneurs in aquaculture? Is it because we lack the knowledge and the technology in the U.S.? Or is it because we have such high environmental standards in the United States? It isn't any of these. It is because we have a permitting process that strangles innovation and it discourages entrepreneurs and investors. Many of the advances in mariculture have been made here in the United States, and the innovators go to other countries, Mexico, Panama, and they create the farms and we buy back the fish. So we may cloak our opposition to environmental concerns, and we like to do that in California, but those claims are ill-founded. We currently import more than 90% of all of our seafood. Most of it comes from Asia. About half of it is farm-grown, and much of it not only has a large environmental footprint, but it's grown under conditions of unknown environmental and social consequences. We need to take the lead in bringing rationality, I think, to redefining our relationship to the ocean and reasserting our intention to become a leading maritime nation. Someone has to take the lead. I don't see why it shouldn't be the Mid-Atlantic Bight, And in many ways, as has already been pointed out by previous speakers, we already are a leader. You've got a lot at stake here. You have a large population in a concentrated area. You've got tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure. You've got some of the leading efforts in marine spatial planning. And you've had a very clear taste of what the future holds. And Sandy or Harvey will come again, and we need to be ready. If I were the czar of the New York Bight, I would establish an ocean park in the Bight. It would have all the base permits in place and would invite entrepreneurs to submit applications for leases. The environmental standards would be high. Part of the lease payments would go to pay for a monitoring program. If they didn't meet the standards, you throw the bums out. If they do meet the standards, you extend their leases in time and perhaps in space. The ocean park would be part water, but also would be part island. And the island could be configured in a way to help protect the New York, New Jersey shoreline from coastal storms. Sandy caused 171 deaths in the U.S. and losses of somewhere between $50 and $75 billion. It will happen again. Doing the kinds of things that we need to do, they are expensive. They'll cost tens of billions of dollars. But when you compare it to the costs of what Sandy did here, Harvey did in Texas and in Florida, the costs are small. I recently watched an interesting old movie, Cool Hand Luke, starring Paul Newman. He was an irrepressible, incorrigible prisoner and a member of a chain gang. He tried to escape a number of times. He was always captured and brought back, and the prison warden's favorite comment was, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." We have that failure in spades when it comes to communicating with the public and decision makers about the challenges and the opportunities we have of living in the new normal, the Anthropocene, and the role the ocean will play. In a new book that called The Human Predicament, A Candid Guide to Life's Biggest Questions, the author tells the story of Sherlock Holmes and his good friend, Dr. Watson, on a camping trip. After dinner and a bottle of wine, they go to sleep. A few hours later, Holmes wakes up his faithful friend, Dr. Watson, and says, "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." Watson replies, "I see millions of stars." And Holmes says, "What does that tell you, Watson?" Watson ponders for a moment, and he said, "Astronomically, it tells me there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, I observe that Saturn is in Leo. Chronologically, I think it's a little past 3 in the morning. Theologically, I can see that God is all-powerful and that we are small and insignificant. And meteorologically, I think we're going to have a beautiful day tomorrow." What does it tell you, Holmes? Holmes is silent for a moment, and then he says, "Watson, you freaking idiot, it tells me that somebody stole our tent." Our problem is quite different from Holmes and Watson. Our view of the boundless opportunities, though, have been kidnapped, and we find ourselves in the situation John Gardner observed when he said, "We are continually faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as insoluble problems." We need to rip off the disguises and seize the opportunities. And it should be in no small part a role of our colleges and universities. I think part of this is we have to tell stories, and we're not so good at telling stories. Chip and Dan Heath, who've written a number of quite important books, had some very good advice on telling stories and making ideas that stick. Andrew Hoffman pointed out that academia is filled with brick makers. This was the theme of an essay that was written by Forscher in Science magazine in 1963. And Hoffman pointed out that it's even more relevant today. Hoffman lamented that academic scholarship has become fragmented and that we now are preoccupied with generating lots of pieces of knowledge, bricks, and we are far less concerned with putting those bricks together into a cohesive whole, things that have power. This is what stories do. And I think that we need to get over this preoccupation with restoration, which means restoring things to some previous condition, and we need to be thinking about creating the coast, not of the future, that'll happen to us, the coast for the future. We have the knowledge, we have the tools, the technology, and it's now become overworked. But remember what Wayne Gretzky, the great one, said when he was asked, to what do you attribute your success? He said, I attribute much of my success to the fact that I skate not to where the puck is, but to where the puck will be. In the environmental field, we don't even skate to where the puck is. We want to skate to where the puck was 10, 20, 30 years ago, and then we're surprised that it's not there when we get there. We need to get over restoration and think about creating the coast for the future. We have all the tools, I think, to do that. And I would start right here in the New York Bight. Let me close with a very brief story from Bell Labs right here in New Jersey. Arno Penzias, a Nobel Prize winner, once said, the thing that distinguishes the most outstanding scientists from the rest of us is not their ability to answer questions. It's their ability to ask deep, rich, penetrating questions. And more recently, an analysis was made of the scientists and engineers at Bell Labs to determine if there were qualities that the most outstanding among them were characterized by. And the results showed it wasn't their SATs or their GREs or their grade point averages or where they got their pedigree. The one distinguishing factor was the number of people they interacted with who had different perspectives, different skill sets, different disciplines, so they were able to ask these deep, penetrating questions. I think this forum is a good example because there are a lot of people here who come from very different disciplines, very different perspectives, and I congratulate you and thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there's a great storyteller. Thank you, Jerry. Terrific. Next, Dr. Paul Doremus, Chief Strategist for NOAA.
Thank you, Admiral. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for moderating, Tony. Thank you for convening this event. It's a great pleasure to be part of this panel, partly because of my work, my institution, what I do, but also because of where I'm from. I'm from the Mid-Atlantic. I grew up on the Jersey coast. My father's family is from the Fairhaven, little town of Fairhaven, right between Red Bank and Rumson. I grew up playing around on the Navesink and all up and down the coast from Seabright to Sandy Hook. And my introduction to the blue economy was when I was 14 and got my first job working for Henderson Aquatics down in Millville making wetsuits. And we developed and tested our wetsuits off the Jersey coast. And during the course of doing that, on a number of occasions, we'd go down through the thermocline, and there would be these giant teardrop-shaped algae blooms, and we'd drop down to the bottom, be nothing, no fish, nothing but dead crustaceans all over the place. So we started looking into that, and that was back in the day. You could stand up on the highlands right at the lighthouses, and you could see the refuse barges tipping up on the horizon, the New York City refuse barges. And then we would, a couple weeks later, we'd find our algal blooms. So in the good old days, in 1974, pen in hand, we were writing our local congressman in South Jersey saying, what are you going to do to keep that stuff from destroying our beaches? And I mentioned the story, and in fact they did. It took many, many years with a lot of pressure from New Jersey, working with New York and with the whole community people set regulations on dealing with ocean dumping. That was completely changed. And I mention this for two reasons. One is not because it's my personal story, but because, to your point, Admiral, on optimism, we've come a long way. Conditions have really changed. When I look at the coastal environment now compared to what I saw in the 70s, both along the coast as well as on the water and under the water, things are quite different. But the other point I think to draw out here quickly is the role of people. And Jerry, I think you spoke to that incredibly eloquently, as you always do. And when we answer the question, Tony, as you put to us, what factors are going to be driving the blue economy, I do want to emphasize right at the outset, particularly sitting here at Monmouth University with so many people as academics, as members of our nonprofit community who touch large numbers of people on a daily basis and shape their attitudes, their understanding of the current world, how it is evolving, where both the challenges and opportunities are. It comes back to people. And that, Admiral, is one of my sources of optimism. I think we have seen enormous change in social attitudes around the environment. The whole concept and thinking and vernacular of sustainability didn't exist in the 70s. And we were pretty ignorant. The science supporting knowledge about our coastal ecological conditions and our ocean uses and what that meant for life along the coast, not to mention our economic activity, it was starting from zero from my reference point. And I do think we've made a lot of progress. So great things on the horizon as well. So one of the factors to answer question number one, in my view, driving the future of the ocean economy, comes down to this concept of sustainability and how it's shaping consumer preferences and consequently corporate behavior. And I also think we have an enormous, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, an enormous opportunity. One of the areas of innovation, lots is happening technologically, but one of the areas of innovation that I think we would benefit from and are starting to benefit from in a big way is thinking about how to harness market forces, how to get price signals right, and how to get incentives structured in a way that principles of sustainability are embedded in how people consume, how they behave, what they look for, and consequently what the private sector delivers. I want to illustrate that in two areas to get around this issue of, or to this second big question, Tony, that you put to us at the outset. What are the factors driving the blue ocean economy? There's obviously a lot, many of which have been queued up this morning through various presentations. I won't reiterate them. The demographic pressures, the environmental ecological pressures, not the least of which is sea level rise, subsidence, and the kind of prolonged environmental change that we're seeing, as well as greater social awareness of risk and vulnerability from storm activity on the coast, which has higher economic consequences as a result largely of increasingly dense communities and economic activity. This Superstorm Sandy had an enormous bearing and impact on this whole region and how we think about sustainability, and I think the whole approach to managing our infrastructure over time to deal with vulnerability to extreme events, as well as these long-term pressures, is really quite fascinating and I think very, very promising. So the one major area that I would point to in terms of factors driving a blue economy in the future is going to be the degree of sophistication that we bring to bear with this type of knowledge in managing our infrastructure assets, our hard infrastructure, as well as our soft or green infrastructure, and how those go together to be able to provide the type of ecosystem service functionality that we need to protect people, to protect economic activity, and to sustain what you might call a more healthy environment. Very much, Jerry, in the spirit you're talking about, the conditions of the future, not so much the restoration of the past. That is out of our reach at this point in time. So on the drivers, demographic, environmental, also enormous attention here, and some of this was highlighted in the early conversations, to new technologies. We have an ability to cost effectively monitor and consequently understand ecological environmental processes and impacts of various uses, and different types of uses, different combination of uses of ocean resources. And I think that capability is very, very promising as well. Lots of new product development potentially coming out of that, but I think the main thing is the cost effectiveness, the density, and the intelligence of the data that we're going to be able to pull forward to be able to inform decisions about competing ocean uses. More people, more demand. We're going to see, whether it's the power economy, lots more wind farms and other types of uses, perhaps ocean energy uses to generate energy. We're also going to see a lot more growth, I think, in the traditional components of the blue economy, not the least of which, as Charlie well pointed out, the travel and tourism industry, the recreational industry. That's the sector I grew up in, making wetsuits. That was largely a recreational dive market that we served, as well as the Coast Guard, by the way. That was our steady client for a while. We have, I think, along with that, to come back as a final note here, in the interest of time, to be able to open it up to questions. We have in both of these areas an opportunity, and I think to refine what I consider to be the prerequisites to be able to sustainably manage the growth of a blue-dependent economy. The one is this science and technology infrastructure. That's where NOAA, it's where the Coast Guard, it's where a lot of our data collection and integration assets come into play. And we can talk about that at great length. The other is the kind of institutional structures and the sophistication of our ability to work across sectors. And this comes back to the market dynamics that I would talk about. On the infrastructure side, probably one of the most powerful things that will affect the future needs as well as opportunities for modifying coastal infrastructure is the insurance markets. And I think we've had, kind of from an economic point of view, just saying off the record perhaps, from my personal observation, the price signals in insurance have not remotely reflected the actual risk and costs to the government, to the economy, to people, of the types of vulnerabilities that we have today, not to mention the vulnerabilities that are going to be increasing in magnitude over time. And we've started to work with, lots of others too, have started to work with the insurance industry, with the reinsurance industry, to think about how to appropriately price insurance, as well as have a kind of private sector angle of entry on building codes and other kinds of very distributed but powerful economic decisions that will shape the incentives to build, where to build, and how to manage hard infrastructure. So that's one element on the private sector side. On the other, and it was just wonderful to hear, Jerry, your account of the potential for drawing greater proportion of our protein supply out of the ocean. This is an area where I'm personally very committed. I had the great benefit of meeting with the Secretary yesterday, Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. He noted, as you did, our trade dynamic. We are importing 90% of the seafood we consume. Half of that's produced in foreign farms. And he wants to change that trade deficit. And aquaculture production is probably, by increasing U.S. supply, is probably one of the best ways to do that. We are on the verge of a fairly significant aquaculture initiative that we have not really kind of converged as a federal government around. I've been working with my colleagues in other elements of the government to do the three basic things that needs to happen. One is to take the stranglehold off, and that's not trivial. Industry wants to maintain very, very high standards, regulatory standards, for those fundamental purposes of sustainability, but they want the system to work more rationally and faster, and that's completely understandable. So we have some first movers out there, Rose Canyon in Southern California, and we've got some very interesting ideas coming out of Long Island. There is a little bit of a bow wave effect, but I think following in the wake of some of the early entrants into the finfish production market is the potential for a substantial follow-on, and we're talking with impact capital, private investors, to understand under what conditions they will invest in domestic finfish production. We've got demand being articulated by major retailers, by large food distributors, and by large processors. They want domestic product. They would like to see safe, sustainable, high-quality, guaranteed supply coming out of U.S. waters. And we can do that. That's completely within our reach. So I think by 2030, that is one area from a blue economy point of view that we are well poised and very well lined up to change. So I'll limit my comments there in the interest of time, and thank you again for the opportunity to be on the panel.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was terrific. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Rear Admiral Linda Fagan, the Deputy for Operations, the United States Coast Guard.
So thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. As I commented earlier, it's always a good day to be outside of D.C. and interacting with some different points of views and diversity of view. I know we're tight on time. I've got kind of three areas that I want to touch on. I want to touch on complexity of the oceans and waterways, and it'll be very complementary to many of the remarks you've already heard. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what is the Coast Guard's role in this particular domain. I have found over the 32 years I've been in the Coast Guard that people will say, oh, yeah, the Coast Guard, we know exactly what you do. And then you start to explain the diversity of what we do under our set of authorities and regulations, and they always say, I had no idea. So we'll touch a little bit on that. And then finally, just challenges and emerging threats. And where I'm going to go with that is into the cyber domain. And I hope to make a compelling argument for why cyber is very relevant to the conversation going on here, and that there's significant risk and challenge for all of us in that domain. And as we've been hearing from the speakers, obviously the waterways are becoming increasingly congested. Human activities continue to increase. The demand for the natural resources and use and utilization for the waterways has done nothing but grow in demand and complexity over the last many years. New technologies are going to challenge those demands, whether it's unmanned maritime systems, Neo-Panamax ships, and different technologies in navigation, all increase that complexity and challenge. And the Coast Guard's got a role in overseeing the system, the maritime transportation system, and ensuring that it's resilient and it's safe and it's secure and it's accessible for all entities that have a need and a desire for accessing it. So a little bit about the Coast Guard. We're the best way to think, we are a military organization. Many in the DoD forget or misunderstand the fact that we are in fact a military service. We are not in the Department of Defense. We're in the Department of Homeland Security. I carry the same ID card as an Army general would carry. But we're a civil agency with law enforcement authorities, and that combination gives us a powerful level of flexibility and ability to be relevant in many of the conversations and the challenges that we're talking about here this afternoon. So, for example, you saw us in the Hurricane Harvey response, rescuing people off of rooftops, running flood punts. And by example, we have some flood punts. We do not have the number that we needed in Houston, but with the authorities and the abilities we have, we were out and, and able to affect many people's lives and save lives. At the same time, we're involved in, environmental response. We have hundreds of pollution responses ongoing in response to the 3 hurricanes that have affected the nation over the last six to 8 weeks, all part of the organic just sort of capability and authorities that the Coast Guard engages in daily. We promote a safe, secure, environmentally sound, and resilient marine transportation system and use risk management and hazard prevention as a tool for helping do that. So we've got an active marine planning, maritime governance process that's very collaborative and in nature. So we'll touch on some of these marine planning tools that we use. Some of you are familiar with the Port Access Route Study tool, the PARS. I'm going to highlight, I know we've had a lot of work here on the East Coast, but for example, we're right now in the Bering Sea and in the Arctic regions. We have had and continue to have a very healthy dialogue with our counterparts in Russia on the Bering Sea and the PARS Access Route Study. I think it's an example of, basically both nations recognizing for mutual benefit the need to have that collaborative conversation. The Atlantic Coast Port Access Route Study, I think it is just absolutely a good news story and an example of what good governance and good collaboration across all of the levels and equity stakeholders can bring to a really complicated conversation. The unique thing about that, the Atlantic Coast Port Route Study, is it looked at the entire Atlantic coast and looked particularly at the offshore routes for ships in a way that allowed that commerce to continue to move, but recognizes the need for economic development and the other demands on uses in the waterway. Again, I see that as a really good news story, and that we identified navigation corridors and also developed marine planning guidelines that help provide some predictability for those that are looking for permits. And again, this concept, don't be the chokehold, right? So these are collaborative tools that help us take some of that chokehold off these hard decisions. The marine planning guidelines have had, again, a direct impact on helping to determine where permanent fixed structures can go and deconflicting that with the need to move commerce and goods safely and securely on our waterways. This group, I'm sure, appreciates, but much of the American public does not, that our very lifestyle, the lifeblood of the economy of this country, flows on the waterways. Off the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf Coast, and the internal waterways. We do not have the economy we have in this country without resilient and secure and predictable access to those main corridors. So let me touch on challenges now. And as I said, the risk portfolio continues to increase. I'm very familiar with the vessel traffic challenges, here in and around the greater New York area. I did not, at the time when I was the captain of the Port of New York, think about what would an autonomous ship bring to that particular risk dynamic. But those are the kinds of technologies and challenges and drivers that are out there. Wind farms, and again, I think the processes and the collaboration is in place to absolutely get to the optimized answer on all deconflicting vessels with some of these more permanent structures. So technology continues to accelerate digital integration, interconnectivity, and then the drive for natural resource exploration and production all drive towards more challenge in this particular realm and domain. So what I want to touch on now specifically is cyber and the cyber threat. And I've talked to a lot of groups, a lot of shipping groups, a lot of facility groups. And a lot of them will say, well, why is the Coast Guard talking to me about cyber? And I would tell you, cyber is a fundamental security risk, business risk, safety risk. And it's not just in the maritime domain, it's in our own personal lives. You can't, I was the OPM hack, Equifax, we've all seen what can happen in the cyber domain from a vulnerability to information that an adversary may be able to access and then exploit. I'm going to give you a very specific example of how this isn't something that's going to happen, it's happening now. Maersk in June of 2017, so Maersk, big international shipping company, they were a target of a basically ransomware, low sophistication ransomware attack. It started in their terminals in Germany and very quickly translated into to some of the facilities here in New York, affected their West Coast operations. When all was said and done, there's an estimate out there that it cost them $300 million in lost revenue. They moved quickly to isolate their system and turn it up so that it would not continue to propagate, but it was about a week for them to resume normal operations in really what was just kind of a low-key ransomware. The ransomware wanted $300 for the attack, but it completely ground their ability. So the ships could come to the port, but they had to use paper to offload the container into the terminal, and then they were challenged in clearing the container off the terminal into the distribution systems that again drive our economy. So you step back, I'll look at the Sony attack. I'll use that as another example. We know who the Sony attack was attributed to, a nation-state actor. It doesn't take a leap of imagination to have a nation-state focus into a segment of our critical infrastructure, be it in the maritime realm or the electrical domain or any area where you've got the internet talking to hardware where you can actually create an effect, and just how disruptive that can be to, again, our very lifestyle. So finally, as technology continues to drive forward, the interconnectedness and the speed of information flow, while it is a tremendous advantage and driver, it can also be a significant vulnerability to us, and we all need to think about how to create the safest, strongest systems that we can as we move forward in the automation domain. My last thought, as a regulatory agency, I am mindful every day that we don't want to be that government agency that's the chokehold on this process moving forward. Having said that, we are a government agency, and it's a perennial challenge for all of the federal entities. The way we get past that and the way the Coast Guard is biased to action is through these coordinating and collaborating bodies, whether it's the work that's been done in the Atlantic region, the Area Maritime Security Committees. We have a number of federal advisory committees. We are wired as an agency, the Coast Guard, to communicate, collaborate, and coordinate. And that's our great strength, and it's the great strength of all of the equity players that we're able to come together and get at some of these hard and challenging issues looking forward. Because there's not one entity that can fix this or get us to where we need to be in 2030, but collectively we can do it. Thank you very much.